They laughed at the old veteran scrubbing the deck, until the Admiral silenced them with a salute. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. The morning on the naval ship was a typical one. Busy, tense, with the faint smell of salt water hanging in the air. Young sailors scurried around, preparing for the day's drills, while some cleaned and scrubbed the deck. But one old man stood out, quietly scrubbing the ship's surface, his hands moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. His name was Frank, and though he looked like just another elderly civilian, there was something about him that commanded attention, though no one seemed to notice it yet. The younger sailors, full of youthful arrogance, couldn't help but snicker as they passed by him. "Hey, Grandpa, are you lost?" one of them called out, a mocking grin on his face. Another sailor chimed in. "You sure you know what you're doing, old man? Shouldn't you be sitting in a rocking chair somewhere?" They laughed, oblivious to the history that stood before them. Frank didn't respond. He simply continued with his work, his hands moving as if they had been doing this for decades, not caring for the mocking comments around him. But as the sailors laughed, they failed to realize the significance of the old man before them. Frank wasn't just any old man. He had been a part of this ship in its prime. He had served in combat zones where the stakes were higher than any of these young sailors could ever imagine. The old man had been through hell and back, many times over. And yet, here he was, quietly maintaining the ship as though it were still a home to him. As the sailors laughed, a figure appeared on the horizon, walking with purpose. A man in a crisp uniform, with medals and insignia gleaming in the morning sun. The Admiral had arrived. The young sailors, unaware of who they were about to meet, continued with their mocking. But the moment the Admiral stepped onto the deck, the air shifted. The laughter stopped. The Admiral, with his commanding presence, walked up to Frank. Without a word, the Admiral raised his hand to his brow in the sharpest, most respectful salute. The sailors froze, their faces turning pale. They realized too late that the man they had mocked was no ordinary civilian. He was a legend, someone who had fought alongside them, saved countless lives, and earned his place among the elite. The Admiral's salute silenced the entire deck. No one spoke. No one moved. The young sailors stood there, their embarrassment palpable, as the Admiral slowly turned to address them. "This man," the Admiral said, his voice booming with authority, "is not just a veteran. He is the heart and soul of this ship. He has been here longer than all of you combined. And he is the reason this ship stands strong today. Show him the respect he deserves." The sailors stood there in stunned silence, the weight of their actions crashing down on them. They had laughed at the old man, not realizing who he truly was. Frank's eyes, steady and unflinching, met theirs. He didn't need to say a word. His presence, his service, and the Admiral's salute spoke louder than any apology could. The lesson was clear. Respect for those who have served runs deeper than any uniform or rank. And as the Admiral turned to leave, the sailors stood at attention, their heads bowed in respect for the man they had so carelessly mocked just moments before. As the Admiral turned to leave the deck, the young sailors were left standing there, frozen in place, still processing what had just happened. The weight of the Admiral's words hung in the air, and the silence on the deck was deafening. Frank, the old veteran, continued his task of scrubbing the deck, undeterred by the sudden attention or the shift in atmosphere. His hands, weathered and rough from years of service, moved with a calm precision. He had been here before, fighting battles on the front lines and battling the tides of time, and nothing could rattle him now. The sailors watched him, their previous arrogance now replaced by a mix of guilt and awe. Their eyes shifted from Frank to each other, unsure of what to say, but the message was clear. The old man had earned their respect, not through words, but through actions, through a lifetime of service that had shaped him into a silent force. As the morning passed, the crew resumed their duties, but the atmosphere had shifted. The mockery that had once filled the air was replaced by an unspoken understanding. Frank didn't need to explain who he was or what he had done. His presence was enough. It was a lesson that the young sailors wouldn't forget anytime soon. Hours passed before the Admiral returned to the deck. He walked with the same purpose, but this time, his eyes landed on Frank as he scrubbed. The Admiral nodded approvingly, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of respect. Frank stopped his work and turned toward the Admiral. For a moment, they stood there in silence, their eyes meeting. Two men who had both served in different ways, but who shared a bond that could only be understood by those who had been through the fire of combat. "I didn't think I'd ever see the day," the Admiral said, his voice soft but steady. "A man like you still here, still serving, after all this time." Frank smiled faintly, his expression unreadable. "A man's duty doesn't end with age, Admiral," he replied, his voice raspy but filled with quiet wisdom. "We serve for as long as we're needed." The Admiral let out a low chuckle. "You're right about that," he said, his gaze lingering on Frank. "You've earned your place here, old man, more than anyone else aboard this ship." Frank nodded, acknowledging the Admiral's words. But he didn't need praise. He had never sought it. His sense of duty, his devotion to the men and women he had served with, was enough for him. As the Admiral turned to leave, he paused for a moment, glancing back at Frank. "You know," he said, "there's a reason why you're still here. Not many men can walk away from a life like yours. Not many can survive the way you have. But you've done it, Frank. You've earned more than your place here. You've earned the respect of everyone who's ever served." Frank watched him leave, his gaze steady, his heart heavy with memories. There had been times in his life when he had felt forgotten, overlooked. But now, in the company of these young sailors, he knew that his journey had mattered. He had left a mark on this ship, on these men, in ways that words could never explain. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light across the deck, Frank returned to his work, his mind at peace. The laughter of the sailors had long faded, replaced by the hum of the ship as it cut through the water. Frank knew that his duty wasn't over. He would continue to serve, to guide, and to protect, as long as he was able. And as the night fell, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that the young sailors had learned something important today, a lesson in respect, in duty, and in the unspoken bond that exists between those who have truly served. As the days passed aboard the ship, a sense of respect for Frank, the old veteran, continued to grow among the crew. The young sailors, once so quick to mock him, now watched him with a quiet reverence. They still didn't fully understand who he was, but they knew he wasn't just any old man. His presence had changed the atmosphere on the ship. His calm, steady demeanor was a stark contrast to the rushed, chaotic energy of the younger sailors. Frank went about his daily duties, working with a sense of purpose that had never wavered. He no longer had to prove himself to anyone. His legacy had already been written. He didn't need the recognition, but it was evident that the young sailors had learned something important in the last few days. Even the most cynical of them began to greet him with a nod or a polite smile, something they had never done before. Then, one morning, the ship was called to action. A distress signal had come through, and the ship had to prepare for a potential deployment. The crew scrambled to get everything ready, the urgency of the situation filling the air. Frank, as usual, was at the heart of it, moving with the same precision and calm that had made him an invaluable asset in his prime. As the ship sailed out into open waters, the young sailors found themselves in a new position, standing side by side with Frank, working together and relying on his steady hand. The Admiral, now more familiar with Frank's background, made sure to acknowledge him in front of the crew. "You've all seen what this man is capable of," the Admiral said during a briefing, his voice carrying across the room. "It's not just about rank or experience. It's about heart and duty. Frank has shown us all what it truly means to serve." The sailors stood at attention, and Frank gave the smallest of nods, acknowledging the Admiral's words, but his gaze never wavered from the task at hand. He had never been one for speeches or recognition. He was here to do a job, and that was all that mattered. As the ship reached its designated location, the sailors prepared for whatever mission lay ahead. Frank, who had been through countless operations in his time, remained calm despite the mounting tension. The younger sailors looked to him for guidance, and though he said little, his actions spoke volumes. In the midst of all the chaos, it was Frank's steady hands that worked the equipment, his sharp eyes that scanned the horizon, and his steady presence that kept everyone grounded. The mission was a success, and when the crew returned to the ship, there was no celebration. No fanfare, just a quiet sense of accomplishment. The young sailors, once unsure of Frank's worth, now understood. He was more than just a veteran. He was the embodiment of everything they aspired to be, dedicated, reliable, and unwavering in the face of adversity. As the days passed and the ship continued its journey, Frank remained a constant presence, always working, always serving, and always teaching. The respect that had once been earned through words had now been earned through actions, and the sailors knew they were better for it. Frank's time on the ship was far from over. He had become more than just a veteran who scrubbed the deck. He had become the heart of the crew, the living reminder of what it truly meant to serve. And though he would never ask for recognition, he had earned it in the most meaningful way possible, through the quiet respect of those around him. As the sun set one evening, casting its golden glow over the ocean, Frank stood on the deck, watching the horizon. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to reflect on the long road that had brought him here. The battles, the sacrifices, and the comrades lost along the way. But more than that, he thought about the future of these young sailors, and the legacy he would leave behind. He may have been an old man, but he knew that in the end, his duty was not just to the mission or to the ship, but to the next generation of sailors who would carry the torch forward. As the ship continued its journey, Frank found himself in the familiar rhythm of life aboard the vessel. His daily tasks no longer met with mockery or indifference. The young sailors, once skeptical of him, now regarded him with respect. They saw him not just as an old man doing menial tasks, but as a living legend, someone who had seen it all, survived it all, and was still standing, doing what he loved. Frank's quiet authority had become the glue that held the ship's crew together. He didn't need to shout orders or deliver grand speeches. His actions spoke louder than any words could. His calm demeanor in the face of adversity had become a lesson in itself. No matter the task, whether scrubbing the deck or ensuring everything ran smoothly, Frank handled it with the same steady hand he'd used in countless battles. It was a lesson the younger sailors had slowly begun to internalize. One day, as they were preparing for another mission, the ship received an unexpected transmission. A sudden storm had formed out of nowhere, and they were ordered to navigate through it. The sea churned violently as the ship swayed with the power of the wind and waves. The young sailors, used to training in calm conditions, were nervous. They had never faced a storm like this. But Frank, as always, remained unfazed. He stood at his station on the deck, his eyes scanning the horizon, his hands steady on the ropes. "Stay calm," he said to one of the sailors nearby. "The sea's not the enemy. It's the fear that's dangerous." The sailor, who had been shaking with anxiety, took a deep breath. Frank's words were simple, but they carried weight. It wasn't the first time he'd faced a storm. Frank had seen his share of violent seas during his time in service. But to the young sailor, those words were a lifeline. They worked together, navigating through the storm as the ship rocked and the wind howled. The younger sailors took cues from Frank, following his every move. His calmness became contagious, and slowly, they began to settle into the rhythm of the task. The storm raged for hours, but Frank never lost his focus. When the storm finally passed, the crew was exhausted but relieved. They had made it through. The young sailors gathered on deck, each one silently processing the experience. They looked at Frank, and for the first time, they saw him as more than just a veteran. They saw him as a mentor, a guide, someone who had helped them find their strength in the face of fear. Later that evening, as the ship sailed under clear skies, the crew gathered for a debriefing. The Admiral, who had observed the crew's performance during the storm, spoke to them with admiration. "Today, you learned what it means to be a sailor," he said. "But more importantly, you learned the value of calmness in the face of adversity. Frank here has been through storms, both literal and figurative, and today, he taught you all something invaluable." The sailors stood at attention as the Admiral turned to Frank. "Thank you for showing us what real leadership looks like," the Admiral said, his voice carrying across the deck. Frank gave a small nod, acknowledging the Admiral's words, but as always, he remained silent. He didn't need the recognition. For Frank, the work was always the reward. The younger sailors, however, couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. They had learned something today that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. As the evening went on and the stars filled the sky above the ship, Frank found himself back at his station. He looked out at the calm sea, the storm now a distant memory. It had been another long day, but as he stood there, the gentle rocking of the ship beneath him felt familiar, comforting. He had lived a life of service, and he would continue to serve as long as he could. It wasn't about the medals or the recognition. It was about duty. It was about knowing that, even at his age, he still had something to offer. The young sailors had learned that today, and in his quiet way, Frank had taught them more than any textbook or drill ever could. He had shown them that true leadership came not from the rank or the uniform, but from the heart. And with that, Frank felt a sense of peace. He had done his job, and he would continue to do so, knowing that the next generation of sailors would carry on the legacy he had left behind. The days passed quickly, and the ship continued its journey across the open seas. The crew, once so divided in their opinions about Frank, now worked together with a newfound unity. There was a sense of purpose on the ship that hadn't been there before. The young sailors, who had once mocked Frank for his age, now took his guidance to heart. They had seen him in action, faced their fears alongside him, and learned from his quiet strength. Frank, however, remained as he always had been, humble, dedicated, and focused on his duty. He didn't seek praise, nor did he need it. His work spoke for itself. But there was a change in the air. The respect from the crew was tangible. They knew, even if they didn't always say it, that Frank had earned something that no amount of time or rank could ever give them: true leadership. One afternoon, as the ship sailed through calm waters, a new challenge emerged. The vessel received orders for a high-stakes mission, one that would require the crew's full attention and skill. A naval exercise that would simulate a combat situation, testing both the ship and its crew under pressure. The crew was nervous. This wasn't just a drill, this was the real deal. The young sailors, who had grown comfortable with their duties, now faced something that would push them to their limits. They gathered on deck, awaiting instructions. Frank, as always, stood at the ready, his eyes scanning the horizon. The Admiral, who had come to respect Frank's experience and wisdom, addressed the crew. "This exercise is unlike anything you've faced before," the Admiral said. "We'll be testing everything we've trained for, our tactics, our teamwork, and our ability to execute under pressure. But most importantly, we will be tested on our resolve." The crew nodded in unison, their expressions determined, though the nervous energy was palpable. Frank stood at the back of the group, silently observing, his presence like a steady anchor. "I know it's going to be tough," the Admiral continued, his voice strong and commanding. "But I have faith in every one of you. We'll get through this as a team." With that, the exercise began. The ship swiftly moved into position, and the crew was put through a series of rapid-fire scenarios, each one designed to test their speed, precision, and ability to think on their feet. Frank, though not as physically agile as the younger sailors, moved with the same steady purpose. He coordinated with the crew, offering quiet guidance when needed, and his calm demeanor provided a sense of stability amid the chaos. The younger sailors found themselves relying on Frank's calm wisdom more than ever. They followed his lead, trusting in his judgment, even when things went wrong. And things did go wrong. Midway through the exercise, the ship's radar system malfunctioned, causing a delay in communications. The younger sailors began to panic, unsure of how to proceed. But Frank, as always, remained unflustered. "Focus," he said, his voice steady. "The mission's not over yet. We adapt. We improvise." His words cut through the tension, and the sailors quickly regained their composure. They worked together, troubleshooting the issue and eventually restoring the radar system. By the time the exercise ended, the crew had faced every obstacle with determination and teamwork. They had made it through a grueling test, and though they were exhausted, there was a sense of pride that filled the ship. The Admiral, who had been observing from the command center, was the first to speak. "Well done, everyone," he said. "You've proven today what you're capable of. But I want to say this. None of this would have been possible without Frank." The crew turned to Frank, who stood silently at the back. The Admiral continued, "Frank showed us today what it means to be a leader. Not with rank, but with action. He led us through this exercise, not by command, but by showing us how to stay calm, how to work together, and how to never give up." The crew erupted into applause, their respect for Frank evident. Frank gave a small nod, but didn't speak. His heart was full, not with pride, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the young sailors had learned something important. As the applause died down, the Admiral turned to Frank and offered him a salute. "You've earned more than your place here, Frank. You've earned the respect of every single one of us." Frank nodded in return, his eyes scanning the crew. The younger sailors, standing tall, met his gaze with newfound admiration. Frank's duty wasn't finished, but, for the first time, he felt the weight of his legacy settling in. He had served his country, his ship, and the next generation of sailors. And in doing so, he had passed on something far more valuable than any medal or award could ever provide: the power of quiet, unwavering leadership. As the sun set over the horizon, Frank stood at the edge of the deck, watching the waves crash against the ship. He knew that the journey wasn't over yet, but he also knew that he had given everything he had to give. And for him, that was enough. The days on the ship seemed to blend together as the crew settled into a rhythm, each sailor finding their place among the ranks. For Frank, though, life continued as it always had. He was no longer just the quiet veteran who scrubbed the deck. He had become an integral part of the crew, his experience, wisdom, and steady presence guiding the younger sailors through each challenge they faced. The respect he had earned was evident, not just in the way the crew interacted with him, but in the way they relied on him. One morning, as the ship sailed through calm waters, the crew received orders for an emergency drill. The exercise would simulate an attack on the vessel, and they would need to respond quickly and efficiently. Tensions rose as the crew prepared for the exercise, and the younger sailors, though more confident than before, couldn't help but feel the pressure. They had faced challenges before, but this felt different. As the drill began, the crew sprang into action. The ship's systems were tested, and each sailor had a specific role to play. Frank, as always, was at the heart of it. Though he wasn't in a position of command, he moved through the ship with a quiet authority, helping where he was needed and guiding the sailors who were unsure of what to do. His calm voice was a beacon amid the chaos. "Keep your heads clear," he said to one of the sailors. "Focus on the task. We've trained for this." The sailor nodded, taking a deep breath, his nerves settling under Frank's steady gaze. Throughout the exercise, Frank worked seamlessly alongside the younger sailors, offering guidance when needed but never overstepping his bounds. He knew that they needed to learn how to handle pressure on their own, but he also knew when to step in. The drill lasted for several hours, and by the time it was over, the crew was exhausted but relieved. They had handled the mock attack with precision, and though there were mistakes, they had learned from them. As they gathered on deck for the debriefing, the Admiral addressed the crew, his voice steady and commanding. "Today, you showed what you're made of," he said. "But there's more to leadership than just executing the task. It's about staying calm when everything is falling apart. Frank here has taught us all that lesson today." The crew looked at Frank, who stood quietly in the back, his hands still calloused from years of service. He had not asked for the recognition, but it was clear that his influence had shaped the way the crew had responded. "Frank has been through more than any of us could ever imagine," the Admiral continued. "He has faced situations that would break most people. And yet, he's still here, still serving. That is the kind of leadership we all need to strive for." The young sailors stood in silence, reflecting on the Admiral's words. They had learned more in these few hours than they had in months of training. The lesson was clear: leadership wasn't about titles or rank. It was about how you carried yourself under pressure, how you guided others without seeking attention, and how you remained unwavering even when everything seemed to be falling apart. As the crew disbanded and returned to their duties, Frank quietly made his way to the deck. The sky above was clear, the sea calm, and for a moment, Frank allowed himself to breathe. It had been a long, tiring day, but he felt a sense of pride, not in the praise he had received, but in the way the crew had come together. He knew that, in his own way, he had helped them become better, and that was enough for him. As he leaned over the railing and watched the ship cut through the water, he thought back to his own early days in the service. He had started out just like these young sailors, full of ambition, full of uncertainty. But through years of hard work, sacrifice, and perseverance, he had earned his place. And now, as he stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he knew that the next generation of sailors would carry on the lessons he had taught them. They were ready, just as he had been all those years ago. Frank turned and walked back to his station, his mind at ease. The ship sailed on, its course steady and true, and Frank knew that as long as he was aboard, it would always be that way. The days that followed the emergency drill were marked by a sense of quiet confidence aboard the ship. The crew, though tired, had grown closer. They had worked together through their first real test, and they had emerged stronger for it. Frank, as always, was a steadying presence among them. His reputation, which had once been built on whispered stories, was now solidified in the eyes of the young sailors. They no longer viewed him as just an old man. He was their mentor, a living embodiment of what it meant to serve with honor. One evening, as the crew gathered on deck to unwind after another long day, the Admiral called for a meeting. His voice crackled through the ship's intercom, summoning everyone to the briefing room. The mood shifted instantly from casual to serious as the crew gathered to hear what the Admiral had to say. As they settled into their seats, the Admiral stood at the front, his usual stern demeanor softened by an air of quiet pride. "I want to take a moment to commend all of you," he began, his voice steady. "You've shown remarkable progress in the last few weeks. But there's one person among you who has taught us all something invaluable." The crew turned their eyes to Frank, who stood quietly at the back of the room. He had grown used to the respect, but it still felt strange to him, like an old coat that no longer fit. The Admiral nodded toward him. "Frank has been a leader to all of us, not through rank, but through his actions. He has taught us the true meaning of service. Today, I'd like to offer him something that I believe he deserves." The room fell silent as the Admiral pulled out a small, worn box. He opened it slowly, revealing a gleaming medal, a recognition of service that was rare, even among those who had given their lives in service to their country. Frank's eyes flickered, a mixture of surprise and discomfort crossing his face. He had never been one for public recognition. He had always felt that duty was its own reward. "This medal," the Admiral continued, "is a token of our appreciation for Frank's years of service, not just to this ship, but to the entire Navy. He has shown us all what it means to serve with dignity, with humility, and with a commitment that never wavers, no matter the cost." The Admiral turned to face Frank, his expression solemn but filled with respect. "Frank, will you come forward?" Frank hesitated for a moment, then made his way to the front of the room. The younger sailors watched him, some of them still in awe of the quiet veteran who had changed the course of their journey. As Frank reached the front, the Admiral placed the medal around his neck. It wasn't just a decoration. It was a symbol of everything Frank had given to his country, everything he had stood for. "Thank you," the Admiral said quietly, his voice carrying across the room. "You have earned this more than anyone else aboard this ship." Frank looked down at the medal, his fingers brushing over its surface. He had never cared for medals, never sought accolades. His greatest reward had always been the knowledge that he had done his duty. But in this moment, standing before the crew he had come to care for, something shifted. He understood now that the respect they had given him was worth more than any medal. It was the bond they shared, the unspoken understanding that no one was ever truly alone in service. "I didn't do this for recognition," Frank said, his voice low but steady. "I did it because it's what I was trained to do. We all serve, not for the medals, but because it's our duty. And duty is the highest calling a man can answer." The crew stood in silence, absorbing his words. They knew that they would never forget this moment, the moment when Frank, the old veteran, had truly become their leader. As the ceremony ended, the Admiral turned to the crew. "Take this lesson with you," he said. "Leadership isn't about authority or power. It's about service, humility, and the quiet strength that Frank has shown us all." Frank returned to his post quietly, the weight of the medal around his neck a reminder of everything he had accomplished and everything he had yet to do. The crew followed him, returning to their duties, but now there was a new sense of camaraderie, a new respect for the man who had stood the test of time and earned their admiration without ever asking for it. As the ship sailed into the night, Frank stood alone on deck, looking out at the endless expanse of water. He had been a soldier, a sailor, and a leader, but above all, he had been a man of duty. And in that moment, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that his service had mattered, not just to him, but to those who would follow in his footsteps. Weeks had passed since Frank had received the medal, and life aboard the ship had returned to a steady routine. The young sailors, once so full of uncertainty and arrogance, had now become a more cohesive unit, their respect for Frank evident in every task they performed. His presence on the ship was no longer just a reminder of the past, but a symbol of resilience, leadership, and quiet strength. As the ship sailed across the open ocean, the crew was called into action once again. This time, it wasn't a drill or a training exercise. The ship had been ordered to assist in a humanitarian mission in a distant region. A nearby island had suffered devastating damage from a natural disaster, and the ship's medical teams and engineers were needed to provide aid. The crew prepared for the mission with the same professionalism they had shown in the past. But as the ship approached the island, a sense of urgency filled the air. The island was in chaos. Buildings were reduced to rubble, and the few survivors were struggling to survive. The crew immediately set to work, providing medical care, food, and supplies to those in need. Frank, as always, found his place in the midst of the crisis. He was no longer just a veteran with a history. He was a man of action, working alongside the younger sailors, organizing the aid efforts, and providing guidance where it was needed most. The crew was pushed to their limits as they worked long hours in the heat, hauling supplies, treating the wounded, and helping to rebuild what had been destroyed. The physical exhaustion was immense, but Frank never faltered. He moved, with the same steady determination that had defined his entire career. As the days passed, the crew began to see the full scope of the disaster. Entire families had been displaced, and the island's infrastructure was in ruins. But through it all, Frank remained a pillar of strength. He didn't complain, didn't show any signs of fatigue. He simply did the work that needed to be done. His quiet presence, his experience in difficult situations, had a calming effect on the rest of the crew. They looked to him, not just for guidance, but for reassurance. One afternoon, as the crew took a brief break, one of the young sailors approached Frank. The sailor, a young man who had once mocked Frank for his age, now looked at him with admiration. "You're not like the rest of us," the sailor said, his voice uncertain. "I mean, you've seen so much, been through so much, and yet you're still out here, doing everything you can to help." Frank looked at the sailor, his eyes softening for the first time in a long while. "It's not about what I've been through," Frank said quietly. "It's about what we can do now. The past is gone. What matters is what we do in the present to help others." The sailor nodded, his expression thoughtful. For the first time, he understood what Frank had been trying to teach them all along. It wasn't about the battles fought or the scars earned. It was about the duty to serve, to help, and to never give up, no matter how difficult the situation. As the mission continued, the crew made incredible progress. They helped rebuild homes, cleared debris, and provided medical care to those who needed it most. But it wasn't just the physical labor that left an impact. It was the bond that had formed between the sailors and the survivors, the sense of unity that came from working together toward a common goal. The island began to recover, slowly but surely, and as the ship prepared to depart, the island's leaders gathered to thank the crew for their efforts. They spoke of the kindness and generosity the crew had shown, and how, without them, the island would still be struggling. As Frank stood at the back of the group, watching the crew receive their thanks, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what he had trained for, what he had served for. Not for medals, not for recognition, but for moments like this. When the work was done, and lives had been changed for the better, that was the true reward. As the crew sailed away from the island, heading back toward home, there was a quiet sense of satisfaction on the ship. The mission had been a success, but more than that, the crew had grown. They had learned the value of service, of leadership, and of never giving up, no matter the circumstances. Frank stood at the front of the ship, his gaze on the horizon. The sea stretched out before him, vast and endless, just like the journey ahead. There would be more challenges, more missions, more trials. But Frank knew that, as long as he was aboard, the crew would be ready. They had learned from the best, and together, they could face whatever came next. As the ship made its way back toward its home port, the crew had grown accustomed to their new routine, a rhythm that blended duty with camaraderie. Frank, the old veteran who had once been seen as just a relic of the past, had become the cornerstone of the crew's spirit. His presence, once a quiet undercurrent, now resonated with a deeper significance. The young sailors, many of whom had started their service with uncertainty and arrogance, had come to view him as their anchor, the quiet leader whose actions spoke louder than any orders could. But even as the ship sailed smoothly across the calm waters, a storm was brewing, both literally and figuratively. The crew had been briefed about their next mission, one that would take them to unfamiliar waters. A training exercise, but this time it was different. This exercise would involve a series of complex maneuvers, testing not just their skills, but their ability to operate under pressure in real combat scenarios. The stakes were high, and the weight of the upcoming test was not lost on anyone. The night before the exercise, the crew gathered in the mess hall, their nerves simmering just below the surface. Frank sat in the corner, his eyes scanning the room. He could sense the unease among the young sailors. He had seen it before, those early days of doubt, the feeling of not being prepared enough for what lay ahead. He could feel their anxiety, but he knew they had come a long way. The younger sailors, however, were still unsure of themselves. They looked to Frank, not for answers, but for reassurance. And Frank, ever the silent leader, offered them what he could. Remember, when the pressure hits, you don't have to be the fastest or the strongest, he said quietly, his voice calm and steady. What matters is the clarity of your mind. Keep your focus. The mission is always bigger than the individual. His words didn't seem to sink in for everyone, but they were enough to calm the nerves of some. The next morning, the ship sailed into the area where the exercise would take place. The waters were rougher than they had expected, the winds gusting fiercely. The crew braced themselves for what was to come, and Frank moved to his post as if he had done this 1,000 times before. As the exercise began, the crew was put through a series of complicated drills. Each maneuver was designed to test their ability to work together, to stay coordinated and calm under the pressure of simulated combat. The younger sailors began to show signs of strain as the exercises intensified. They hesitated, made small mistakes, and began to second-guess themselves. But Frank, always steady, was there to guide them. His voice cut through the chaos. Stay on course. Trust your training. It wasn't much, but it was enough to push the sailors forward. As the day wore on, the crew faced obstacle after obstacle. Engine malfunctions, miscommunications, and even a mock attack that sent them scrambling to defend their position. Frank, though, never wavered. His hands moved with precision, his mind sharp. He wasn't leading them from the front, but in every corner of the ship, his steady influence was felt. And as the day turned into night, the crew began to find their rhythm. They started to work together, relying on the strength of their training and the silent leadership that Frank had provided. The ship completed the final phase of the exercise with remarkable efficiency. It hadn't been easy, but they had done it. The crew, once divided and uncertain, had proven themselves to each other. As they gathered on deck to reflect on the day's work, the Admiral addressed them. "You've all performed admirably," he said, his voice full of pride. "This exercise was designed to test your ability to handle pressure, and you did it. But none of this would have been possible without Frank." The crew turned to Frank, who stood at the back, his hands still calloused from years of service. He didn't ask for the recognition, but it was there nonetheless. The Admiral continued. "Frank showed us how to lead under pressure, how to keep calm when everything is falling apart. His example is what got us through this exercise." The crew stood at attention, their respect for Frank clear in their expressions. Frank nodded, acknowledging the Admiral's words, but said nothing. His eyes scanned the crew, each sailor now standing a little taller, a little more certain of themselves. The Admiral turned to Frank one last time. "Frank," he said, his voice softer now, "you've been through so much. But you've shown us all that leadership isn't about rank or glory. It's about heart, and you've given us all that in abundance." Frank, always humble, simply nodded. The Admiral's words were enough for him. As the crew filed back to their stations, the young sailors couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude toward the old veteran. They had faced one of their toughest challenges yet, and it had been Frank's quiet strength that had helped them through. As the ship sailed into the sunset, the crew knew they were ready for whatever came next. They had learned the greatest lesson of all, that leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice or the most decorated soldier. It was about doing the work, staying calm under pressure, and always putting the mission first. And for that, they would forever be grateful to Frank. The days that followed the exercise were filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The crew, now fully aware of their capabilities, worked with a newfound sense of confidence. Frank, though he hadn't sought out this transformation in the crew, had played a vital role in shaping their journey. His steady hand had guided them through the storm of uncertainty, and now they had become a unit that could face anything. However, as the ship continued its course, the crew was called to perform a mission far more complex and dangerous than anything they had faced before. They had been ordered to provide security and support to a high-stakes diplomatic operation in a volatile region, one that was known for its political instability and risk of conflict. The mission would require the crew's skills to be tested at every level. They prepared themselves for what was to come. The atmosphere aboard the ship became charged with a sense of urgency. The sailors, now accustomed to the rhythm of life on the vessel, began to take the new orders seriously. They knew the stakes had been raised, and the eyes of the world would be on them. Frank, who had seen his share of tense situations, remained as calm as ever. He moved quietly among the sailors, offering advice when necessary, but mostly allowing them to grow into their roles. As they approached the destination, the tension among the crew grew thicker. The young sailors, who had proven themselves in training, now faced a situation that felt much closer to real danger. The ship's crew assembled in the briefing room, where the Admiral gave his final instructions. "This mission is about more than just protecting the diplomats," the Admiral said. "It's about making sure we leave this region with our heads held high, showing that we are not only skilled soldiers, but we also have the discipline and integrity to handle even the toughest situations. I have full confidence in all of you. But remember, this is not a drill." As the meeting concluded, the crew was sent to their posts. Frank, ever observant, took his place at the center of the action. He was no longer just the veteran. He was the guiding hand that helped the crew navigate the complexities of the mission. The next several days were filled with careful preparation. They worked through simulations, fine-tuned their protocols, and made sure every sailor knew their role inside and out. Frank observed the young sailors as they trained, noticing the changes in their demeanor. They had grown more disciplined, more focused. They trusted each other now, and that trust was what would carry them through the coming challenge. When the day of the mission arrived, the ship docked in a region that was teetering on the brink of conflict. The political climate was tense, and the crew knew that one misstep could escalate into something far more dangerous. But as always, Frank kept his cool. The mission began as planned, with the crew providing security and overseeing the safe passage of the diplomats. As the hours passed, the tension never dissipated. Every movement was calculated, every decision weighed carefully. The young sailors, once uncertain and inexperienced, moved with the confidence of those who had learned the true meaning of duty. Frank worked alongside them, but he remained in the background, offering subtle guidance when needed. It wasn't long before the ship's security was put to the test. A situation arose that threatened to spiral out of control. A group of local factions had become agitated and were moving dangerously close to the area where the diplomats were gathered. The crew was put on high alert, and the situation rapidly escalated. The younger sailors, who had been through so much with Frank, now found themselves in a real-life scenario where every second counted. They looked to Frank for guidance. With calm authority, Frank gave his orders, moving quickly to ensure that everyone was in position. "Stay sharp, stay calm," Frank said, his voice steady. "We've trained for this. We know what to do." His words steadied the crew. As the situation unfolded, Frank coordinated with the Admiral and the ship's officers, ensuring that the crew worked together seamlessly. His leadership, once a quiet force, was now fully realized in the most critical of moments. After what felt like hours, the threat was neutralized. The young sailors had done it. They had held their ground and ensured the safety of the diplomats. It wasn't just about security or tactics. It was about maintaining their composure under pressure, just as Frank had taught them. As the mission concluded and the ship began its journey back, the crew was exhausted but triumphant. They had faced the real-world consequences of their training, and they had come out stronger for it. The Admiral gathered the crew on the deck once again, his expression proud. "Today, you showed what you're truly made of," the Admiral said. "And Frank, once again, you have proven to be the backbone of this crew. Your steady hand has led us through yet another storm. Thank you for your unwavering leadership." Frank, ever humble, simply nodded. He didn't need praise. The look in the eyes of the young sailors, their respect and gratitude, was enough. As the ship sailed into the sunset, the crew knew they had grown. They had learned not just how to survive, but how to lead, how to serve, and how to face any challenge with confidence. Frank, their quiet leader, had shown them the way. As the ship made its way back toward home port, a sense of calm had settled over the crew. The tension from the diplomatic mission had lifted, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Yet, even in the midst of their success, the crew knew that they had been tested in ways they hadn't fully understood until the crisis was over. Frank, as always, had remained a constant presence throughout the operation. His quiet authority and steady guidance had been the compass for the crew in their moments of uncertainty. As the crew began to regroup, Frank noticed the subtle changes in them. Their confidence, their growing sense of unity. They had learned to trust one another, and more importantly, they had learned to trust their training. One evening, as the ship sailed peacefully through calm seas, the crew gathered on deck for a rare moment of rest. The sky was painted with the warm hues of the setting sun, and the atmosphere was relaxed, almost meditative. Frank stood at the edge of the deck, his hands resting on the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He had spent many years of his life at sea, but there was something about this moment that felt different. As he stood there, reflecting on everything that had happened, the younger sailors gathered nearby, their conversation hushed in deference to him. They no longer needed to be reminded of the importance of their work. They had learned that lesson on their own. But tonight, they wanted to talk to Frank, not as a leader or a mentor, but as a man who had been through it all. One of the sailors, a young man who had come to respect Frank more than anyone, stepped forward. "Frank," he began, his voice a little uncertain, "we've all learned so much from you. I don't think we ever really understood what it meant to serve, what it meant to give everything for something bigger than ourselves. But you've shown us that." Frank turned to face him, his expression calm, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes. "You've all shown me something too," he said softly. "I've been at this for a long time, and I've seen a lot of good men and women come and go. But this crew, you're different. You've got heart. You've got something that not everyone has, and that's what's going to get you through the hard times." The young sailor nodded, but he was still struggling to find the right words. "I guess what I'm trying to say is that we didn't really appreciate what we had until we saw you in action. You didn't need to tell us what to do, Frank. You just did it. And that's why we're all standing here now." Frank chuckled softly, a dry, almost nostalgic sound. "You'll all get there," he said. "It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up every day, doing the work, and making sure you're always there for each other. That's what matters." The young sailor looked at Frank, his eyes filled with gratitude. "And that's what you've done for us," he said quietly. "You've shown us what it means to be a part of something bigger. You've been the one we could always count on." Frank nodded, his gaze returning to the horizon. The crew, now gathered around him, fell silent as they looked out at the sea. There was a shared understanding between them, a connection that had been forged through their experiences and their mutual respect for one another. It wasn't something that could be easily put into words, but in this moment, they didn't need to speak. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the crew began to disperse, returning to their posts and their duties. But Frank remained at the railing, lost in thought. He had spent much of his life in the service, and though he had always been a quiet leader, he had never fully realized the impact his actions could have on others. Tonight, as he stood alone on the deck, he understood that his purpose had never been about accolades or recognition. It had always been about the people he served with, the crew he had guided and mentored, helping them find their strength when they needed it most. As the ship sailed on, Frank felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had done his part. He had passed on the lessons he had learned through years of service, and now, it was up to the next generation to carry that torch. The horizon ahead was still uncertain, but Frank knew that the crew would be ready. They had become a team, a family, bound together by their shared experiences and the quiet leadership of one old veteran. The ship continued its journey, the water cutting smoothly beneath it, and Frank knew that wherever it took them next, they would face it together. The days that followed were marked by a sense of calm and reflection on the ship. The crew, having faced some of the toughest challenges together, had grown even closer. Frank, though now well into his years, continued to serve with the same quiet dedication that had earned him the respect of the entire crew. His reputation had spread far beyond just the immediate crew members. Even higher-ranking officers began to seek his counsel in moments of doubt. As the ship made its way through the vast expanse of the ocean, the crew's unity was more apparent than ever. They were no longer just a group of sailors performing their duties. They were a team, a family, bound together by shared experiences and the lessons they had learned. But even with this newfound sense of solidarity, Frank knew that there was one more test ahead of them. The Admiral had briefed the crew on their next mission, one that would take them deep into hostile waters. It wasn't an easy assignment. Diplomatic tensions had been rising in the region, and the ship would be providing security for a key international summit. The stakes were high, and Frank could sense the anxiety among the younger sailors. They had come a long way, but now they were being asked to step up in a way that none of them had anticipated. The mission was far from a simple escort. They would need to work with various international forces, and the pressure to perform well was immense. As the day of departure drew closer, Frank observed the sailors around him. They were more than capable, but he saw the flickers of doubt in their eyes. The weight of the mission had begun to settle over them, and for some, it was clear that the reality of what they were about to face was beginning to sink in. One evening, as the ship sailed quietly under the stars, Frank found himself on deck, looking out over the water. The sea was calm, but there was a storm building in the hearts of the crew. Frank wasn't one to speak often, but when he did, it was always when the crew needed it most. He noticed a small group of sailors standing near the railing, talking among themselves, their voices low. They didn't see him approach. "What's on your mind?" Frank asked quietly, his voice carrying just enough for them to hear. The sailors turned, surprised, but then their expressions softened. One of the younger men, a sailor who had been with the crew for less than a year, spoke up. "I don't know, Frank," he said, his voice unsure. "I'm starting to feel the weight of all this. We've done our job, but this feels different. We've got a lot riding on us." Frank nodded, understanding the sentiment. He had been in that position many times before, feeling the pressure of a mission that could mean the difference between success and failure. "You're right," Frank said. "But that's why we're here. We're trained for this. You don't need to worry about the weight of it all. Just focus on doing your part and trust your training." The young sailor looked uncertain, but there was something in Frank's words that seemed to give him a sense of reassurance. It wasn't the promise of success, but the confidence that the crew would be ready, whatever came their way. "We've got each other," Frank continued. "That's what matters. No matter what happens, you're not alone in this. We're all in it together." The group stood in silence for a moment, the weight of Frank's words settling over them. The pressure didn't disappear, but for the first time, the crew understood that they didn't need to bear it alone. The next morning, the crew gathered for the final briefing before heading into the mission area. The Admiral was calm as he addressed them, but his words were laced with the seriousness of the operation. "This is the moment we've all been preparing for," the Admiral said. "We know what's at stake, but I have no doubt that each and every one of you is ready. We've worked hard to get here, and now it's time to show the world what we're made of." The crew nodded, the tension in the air palpable, but they stood taller now. They had faced many challenges, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about following orders. It was about proving themselves as individuals and as a team. As the mission began, Frank once again found himself working alongside the crew. He didn't need to be in the front, didn't need to take the spotlight. His role, as always, was to guide, to keep the crew focused, and to ensure that everything went according to plan. The mission progressed, each step more critical than the last, and the young sailors worked together as they had never done before. In the heat of the moment, they remembered Frank's words: "Trust your training, trust your teammates, and stay focused." It wasn't about the individual, but the collective strength they shared. The mission was a success, and as the ship made its way back home, the crew knew they had faced one of their toughest challenges yet and emerged victorious. Frank stood at the front of the deck as they sailed, the horizon stretching out before him. The sea had been calm, but he knew that the journey wasn't over. The crew had grown in ways they hadn't expected, and Frank had helped guide them there. His work was never done, but he knew that the future of the crew was in good hands. As the ship neared its home port, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere among the crew. The mission had been a success, but more than that, It had marked the culmination of a journey that had transformed them all. Frank, though he had never sought accolades or recognition, had become the quiet cornerstone of the crew. He had shown them, through his actions, what true leadership looked like, and in doing so, had changed their understanding of what it meant to serve. The young sailors, once unsure of their purpose, now stood tall and confident. They had come to realize that leadership wasn't about medals or titles. It was about resilience, humility, and always doing what needed to be done, regardless of the circumstances. As the ship docked, the crew gathered to prepare for their return to civilian life, a bittersweet moment. They had learned invaluable lessons from Frank, and it was clear that they would carry those lessons with them long after they left the ship. The Admiral, who had come to hold Frank in the highest regard, addressed the crew one final time. "You've all come a long way," he said, his voice full of pride. "You've faced challenges that would break most, but you've stood strong. And Frank, you've shown us all what it means to lead with quiet strength, without ever needing to take the spotlight." Frank stood at the back, as he always did, watching the younger sailors. He had never been one for speeches or public recognition, but he could see the change in them, and that was enough for him. The Admiral paused, allowing the words to sink in. "Frank," he said, turning to the old veteran, "you've been a mentor, a guide, and a leader to us all. It's an honor to serve alongside you." The crew stood at attention, their respect for Frank clear in the way they held themselves. Frank, ever humble, nodded in acknowledgement but said nothing. His gaze was steady, unwavering, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of what he had accomplished. He had passed on the lessons he had learned throughout his life and service, not through words, but through action. It wasn't about recognition or accolades. It was about preparing the next generation to carry the torch. As the crew disembarked from the ship, Frank took one last look at the vessel that had been his home for so long. The memories of the battles fought, the lessons learned, and the friendships forged filled his mind. But more than anything, he thought of the young sailors he had mentored, the ones who had once looked at him with skepticism, who now stood with the same quiet strength he had shown them. Frank knew that the ship would sail on, but his work was done. He had done what he came to do. He had served, not for glory or recognition, but for the next generation. And as he walked down the gangplank, his heart was at peace. He had fulfilled his duty. The future was in good hands. This emotional story follows the journey of an old veteran named Frank, who quietly leads a crew of young sailors through various challenges, transforming them into a united team. His calm demeanor and life experience become the key elements that help the crew overcome the toughest missions. As the crew faces tense diplomatic situations, life-threatening drills, and high-stakes operations, they learn invaluable lessons from Frank's quiet strength and leadership. This emotional story not only highlights Frank's impact on the sailors, but also the profound lessons they learn about duty, respect, and sacrifice. The crew, once uncertain and divided, finds their purpose as they come together, guided by Frank's wisdom. The emotional story touches on themes of leadership, resilience, and the unspoken bond that forms between those who serve together. Through each mission, Frank's influence is felt deeply, showing the crew what true service and leadership mean. This emotional story explores the powerful transformation of a group of sailors as they learn the meaning of service and the importance of mentoring the next generation. By the end of the journey, the sailors are no longer just a crew. They are a family, united by the values they learned from Frank. The emotional story concludes with Frank's quiet peace, knowing he has passed on the torch to the next generation of leaders, ensuring that his legacy of service will continue.